takes. Get your hot takes on Ukraine, baby.
Let's go.
Hello, we're doing it. Everyone's doing it. Sitting in their $300 gaming chairs, trying to filter information from across the world to get some special insight on an event they know nothing about. You gotta have a take. Here's a take for ya. I don't got a take. I know nothing about this. I don't know anything about geopolitics. I don't know nothing about whether Putin is a rational actor. And I have spent Invasion Month not learning a single thing about it. So when it was suggested that we do a Ukraine episode, I vetoed it because the only war that matters, of course, is the culture war. But then it was suggested that we cover the mystical, dark, philosophical entity looming in the background of the Ukraine invasion. And now that makes for an episode.
Yeah,
That's
I love
what we need.
I mean, luckily we're bringing in some more interesting stuff, I think, but yeah, the debate around Ukraine was kind of funny to see people like want to adopt these different like causal narratives about like why Russia invaded Ukraine. And I don't know, as someone who's in a political science department and, you know, is around people who study international relations, it was just interesting to see people all of a sudden like adopt like IR realist perspectives to say that, oh, like, you know, it's because of NATO expansionism and all this stuff. And people saying things like, oh, NATO expansion caused. And it's like anytime people talk about causal links, I mean, political science is a dismal science. Like there is no like ascription of like a definitive causal connection. There are many compounding factors. And if you talk to any honest political scientist, they'll tell you that. But there's just a lot of confidence about like what caused what. And it was just funny to me to see people make definitive statements about something that ultimately it is the nature of such social political phenomena. I don't really think it's possible to make a definitive causal statement. So,
Indeed. And of course, there is an army of armchair experts. I guess we're singing with the choir today. We've got our armchair psychologists telling us whether or not Putin is sane, what he expected to come from this, how his career as a spy informs his decision-making processes. We have armchair generals predicting the next move of Russian forces. We have armchair insurrectionists telling Ukrainians, who probably have better things to do, let's be honest, how to make anti-tank mines out of old toasters or whatever. And now you have us, your armchair intellectuals, who are about to tell you why this really happened. It's because philosophy. It's because Hegel is bad. That's why.
And then you also get the delightful tankies who are coming out and being apologists for Putin.
Yes, the tankies defending that great communist leader.
Yeah, the great
Putin.
communist Putin. It's so funny too to see people like the edgelords have like little. I mean, first of all, we were just before we started recording talking about zombies. We've got like the zombies with the Ukraine flag in their Twitter bio, and then we've got the edgelords with the Russian flag in their fucking Twitter bios.
Yeah, I guess you could say, you know, it's multi-causal. This isn't a single cause incident. That's the problem, right? Everybody wants to simplify it to a single cause, but you know, remember back to learning about World War I, right? The Black Hand assassinating the Archduke was okay. The spark that lit the powder keg, right? And then the powder keg was all of these different geopolitical and historical arrangements that emerged, and the history is extremely complicated. And like basically, you know, unless you're gonna do the work, then just shut the fuck up and you know, enjoy the goddamn ride and don't pick sides and treat this like it's a team sport. Okay, it's
so this is us shutting the fuck up.
Yeah, this is. And just to contradict exactly what I just said, let's go. Episode.
Yeah, no, I saw a meme the other day where somebody was like, whatever previous geopolitical beliefs you happen to have, the war in Ukraine vindicates them. And that's more or less been the response that I've seen. And it's kind of annoying. But to Victor's point, I've even had students come up to me at the end of a class on mediation, alternative dispute mechanisms in Canada, being like, can you give me your thoughts on the war on Ukraine? And I'm like, I don't know what you got from me talking about how mediation works in the province of Ontario, but sure, why the fuck not? I mean, there's a real hunger for commentary on this, and I can kind of understand why. A lot of people don't really know that much about Eastern Europe or the geopolitics around there. So I guess they're just turning to anyone who seems to have some kind of expertise in something for resources on that front.
So we have a major conflict, or I don't even know if it's a major conflict. There's conflicting reports. And we did, if you remember a few months ago, an episode on hyperreal war. And that was Gulf War as the first live news broadcast war. And what do you guys think about this? This seems like the first social media war in the same sense.
I don't think it's a war. I heard it's a special military operation.
Yeah.
I got that from right from the top.
It's a denazification effort. He's just getting rid of a few Nazis and a bad problem.
I don't know.
War is always about information and disinformation, and trying to follow this from the outside, I think, is totally futile. There's 5,000 dead. No, there's 10,000 dead. Oh, they're denazifying. No, we're denazifying them. No, they're the Nazis. They're the Nazis. So, and then everyone just decides to take a side. You know, I #stand with Ukraine.
I mean, I think there's two aspects to the Gulf War didn't happen statement that Baudrillard makes. Like, one, it was, that the first television mediated war. So it's pure spectacle. In other words, all the images aren't, some explaining some reality that the images are pointing to. All of the press and coverage is part of it. Okay. And then the other point is, like, a war isn't when one extremely overpowered side with a mass amount of technology comes in and just obliterates the other side. That's not a war. That's a slaughter. But that's kind of splitting hairs, right? Because we see, when two sides are fighting, there's a war. But I'm sure there are certain, if we want to get more specific about what a war is, you need two relatively equal armies fighting, and that's not what has happened for a long time. There hasn't been two equal armies fighting. There's been the United States and their allies, which are OP as fuck, and then there's everyone else who gets in their way. But now China, Russia, and other places are able to challenge that hegemony.
I have a somewhat different take. So my first take on this is, I think that in some respects, this affirms Baudrillard's intuitions about the changing nature of warfare even better than the Gulf War does. I was just thinking the other day that if there was ever a war where you would want an actor being your president, this is the one. Because Zelensky has done a fantastic job of literally playing the heroic Ukrainian, standing against, the invading Russian hordes. And he's solicited worldwide sympathy because he's played into that role so effectively.
And in case people don't know, Zelensky was an actor in Ukraine, and he was literally in a movie or I think it was a show where he played a school teacher who then decides to run for president on an anti-corruption campaign. And then in real life, that actor ran on an anti-corruption campaign and won with the exact same party name as the name that was used in the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Real.
It's literally like some scenario where Harrison Ford plays a U.S. president
Air Force
One, and then decides, I'm actually going to run for president.
Get off my plane.
But then all of a sudden he's in the same scenario and he actually does a pretty good job of it. And you're like, oh, wow, we made the right choice. On the other hand, I do think that this is also a real war in the sense that, for instance, the Gulf War wasn't, for exactly the reasons that Eric gave, which is that an extraordinarily one-sided conflict can't really be described as a war in the conventional sense. Because it does seem like the Ukrainians are actually doing a fairly good job of repelling the Russian advance at tremendous cost.
Heavy international support.
With heavy international support.
Everyone's sending them weapons and
which
love.
is really interesting. So
yeah, it's more of a two-sided conflict than I think any of us expected, right?
Well, one of the narratives that was going on, which is actually related to the Philosopher we're going to talk about a little bit later, and kind of like Russian nationalism. One of the narratives that I was seeing online was, okay, Putin has been spending all this time kind of watching the West, in like air quotes, the West, Europe, North America, like Canada, the United States, etc., have never been more divided internally, right? So, and then of course people allege that Putin has been, running this disinformation campaign, the Trump election, all this stuff, just online with troll farms, trying to divide. And it's true. I feel like, in a way, right before he invaded Ukraine, we were arguing over trucker protests and vaccine mandates, internally extremely divided. And I would say in some ways identityless and purposelessness was kind of rampant. And I think maybe Putin thought, okay, this is the perfect time because they can't even agree on simple things internally. So now I'll attack Ukraine and they won't do shit. Nothing's going to happen. And I would say that it seems like if that was his strategy, it seems to me that it's kind of backfiring, because I would say, we haven't really seen this much unity between sort of like Western countries since probably like World War II. I mean, even more so in some sense, because even neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland hasn't taken a side on a geopolitical conflict since the Napoleonic Wars, and they're sending weapons to Ukraine, which is crazy.
I want to point out, this has even surprised me because some of the countries that seemed on the fence about these issues, like Poland or Hungary, have now kind of firmly, or some of the Baltic states as well, kind of firmly sided with the West or with NATO, however you want to connote it, when it comes to the Russia conflict. And I didn't exactly expect that to happen, in part because so many of these regimes are kind of mixed authoritarian regimes that seem to draw a lot from Putinism. And yet, now in Poland, there are just mass reserves of weapons that are going to be shipped to the Ukraine.
It's hard for me to believe that with all the military intellectual capital that I assume exists in Russia, that they wouldn't have seen this coming. They're all disunified. Now's the perfect time to attack. Now's the perfect time to give everyone an excuse to unify against some external quote unquote threat. Right? Have you seen any sci-fi movies? Like, that's always what fucking happens. Everyone's fighting and then an alien invades and everyone comes together to repel the invaders, and then magically a better world is born afterwards.
Yeah. So his very big mistake was doing anything while everyone was bored as fuck.
Well, I mean, I think the problem is, and again, this goes back to kind of like ascribing a causal connection or ascribing a psychological motive. Like, it's hard because, like a lot of arguments assume a kind of rational actor. They assume that Putin is a rational actor, and obviously like that's not a good assumption to make. So it's just hard to know. What you can really do is try to be like, okay, well, what might be his like perception of like reasons to invade? And obviously that's one account, but I mean, I can't actually think of a good reason.
We know the answer, and we're about to give it to you, listener.
Big promises.
Big pause.
Drum roll.
As good Hegelians, we do know what causes conflict in the world, and it is the movement of history. So, we know.
There you go.
Everyone else was surprised. Yes, the cause is history, in case you didn't know. Everyone else was surprised when this happened, but we knew. We've looked at the philosophical underpinnings of Eurasian nationalism as told by, get ready for this, pagan occultist / traditionalist / Orthodox Christian / fascist / Stalinist who didn't think Hitler was so bad. Bad, but not so bad. And he's got definitely a Rasputin aesthetic going on, and supposedly also having Putin's ear. To what degree, I have no idea. Maybe you guys know. But he wrote a book claiming that it was Russia's historical right, nay, duty, to annex Ukraine in the service of a new Russian empire, which is the only thing that can hold back the tide of moral and cultural decadence emanating around the globe from the West and from the USA. And this book is what, like 20 years old already?
He's written a lot, but the book wasn't Fourth Political Theory written a little bit more recently, like 2011?
2009, and it was published in English in 2012, and then there's a new edition that came out recently. No, I mean, 1997 is when he released his, I think it's Foundations of Geopolitics is how it's usually translated, text. And even at that point, he was starting to talk a bit about pan-Eurasianism and the kind of anti-American or anti-liberal bloc. It just wasn't given the kind of philosophical gloss that you find in the Fourth Political Theory. Which,
and we're talking about Aleksandr Dugin here, the Russian Rasputin.
Oh, you spoiled it.
Everyone's favorite fascist Santa Claus.
We're talking about, honestly, this is the scariest philosopher. That he's like evil. I mean, Heidegger's already pretty evil, but this is like dark Heidegger, dark timeline Heidegger.
Heidegger is like Darth Vader. He want deep down inside there's like a goodness to him, but this is like Emperor. This is Emperor Palpatine.
His erudition, his learning is quite astonishing. Though he does cite wide range of theorists. He knows his shit. But yeah, I mean, clearly he's playing this sort of role, or been ascribed this role as a kind of state philosopher, and he, it's hard to separate what parts of his ideas he's borrowing, which seem somewhat cogent, and which ones are being fitted into this sort of role he's playing. And you can imagine he can't, if he says the wrong thing, he could run afoul of the Kremlin and get booted out.
So for over 20
considerations.
years, though, he's been saying we need to unify the Russian-speaking peoples of Ukraine, and Ukraine's not even a real country anyway, so we should just take it back.
Yeah, there's like a unified Eurasian culture is kind of like the term he likes to use. But Dugin is interesting because I've probably spoken about this on the podcast before, but I first learned, and I've been kind of fascinated on the side with Dugin, because in my department of political science at the University of Toronto, there was like a famous
you had that controversy. Yeah, go ahead.
You had a controversy with this student, Michael Millerman, who's now fairly like well known on Twitter in certain kind of like conservative intellectual circles, whatever. And so he was writing his dissertation, which I think it was a very interesting topic, and he ended up publishing it as a book with a questionable press. But anyway, leave that aside for now. But the topic I think was very interesting.
The word is a fascist press.
Yeah. But he was doing basically like, I think what is on the surface very valuable work, which is just like comparing or like reading Heidegger as a political thinker and basically doing a comparative analysis of 4 readings of Heidegger. One being Leo Strauss, another being Derrida, another being Richard Rorty, and then the 4th being Dugin. So his dissertation was on that. And then what ended up happening is his committee at the time kind of found out who Dugin was after they were initially working with him, realized Dugin was kind of crazy and had like very reactionary, we'll talk about whether or not he's a fascist, but, seemingly fascistic views. And they all ended up essentially resigning from his committee. And he struggled to finish his PhD. And he actually, ironically, the person who ended up supervising him and didn't resign from his committee is actually like a post-colonial, like Derridian, far left political theorist who is like, whatever, this guy's smart. Like he's doing good work. Like I want to help him on to finish his PhD. She just, from kind of like an intellectual values level, didn't agree with what was happening in the department. There's actually a National Post story written about this. So all of this is like public knowledge. It's not really like inside gossip.
Must have been a bunch of liberals on his committee.
Yeah,
it was a bunch of liberals on his committee.
Cancel culture, but there's the tolerant left for you.
And he said that he actually made that comment. He's like, all the people who resigned from my committee were kind of like either Straussian center, like leftist Leo Strauss types, or like center left kind of like, I mean, they were like liberals basically.
Which all plays perfectly into these narratives that you get from Dugin and from Peterson and from Trump. You get these narratives about cancellation and centrist and left liberals being moralistic. And I mean, they just play right fucking into that, don't they? They put their foot in their mouths. Like, don't resign on moral principles. That's so stupid.
I do want to.
And the one who supervised him, Ruth Marshall. So this is again public knowledge in the article. She basically like said exactly that. That it's playing into their hands, and this is like a dumb thing. I'm going to supervise him.
All right, we're gonna get to Matt here to actually introduce this character to us in a second. But the last thing about the intro that I wanted to bring up was how weirdly close some of his language is to Fanon. Fanon, who is a Pan-Africanist, post-colonial, revolutionary theorist, like very far left, communist. And then Dugin on this, I don't even know if this fits the right left axis very neatly, but this, we need to resist the imperial center, we need to resist imperial domination from the West.
Pan-Eurasianism.
We need to establish a personal identity for Russo Slavic extended peoples.
Yeah.
And we need to resist Americanism. So you get a nice mirror, a nice parallel.
I think I made that comment when we were doing our Fanon episode that a lot of his arguments could fit into, I don't know if I said Dugin by name, but I think I made the comment that it could fit into some conservative kind of reasoning.
And he loves pragmatism too. I was just watching a thing, like he loves American pragmatism. He says, "Oh, America, you're losing your true spirit, capitulating to these globalist liberals. You need to get back to your pragmatist roots and read Emerson and read James. And, oh my God, it's weird. Anyway, sorry. Go on, Matt. We'll get to Matt now.
Yeah. So if you ever wanted an episode where Matt talks a lot, this is that, because he's the expert on this.
Yeah, you actually read all of the fourth political theory, and Pills was saying maybe he doesn't fit on the left-right spectrum, but maybe you could also explain, because the title of the book is kind of speaking to that whole complication of the left-right spectrum.
After you talk about who he is, be like, what are these four things?
And you should also our listeners should look at this Wikipedia page, because he is variously a Gnostic, Satanist, occultist, but also a traditionalist Christian, and it's very confusing. He was part of a Satanist group that studied the Waffen, the SS Waffen division's
Is that true?
occult studies. So It's a fun Wikipedia page. But anyway, Matt, who is this guy? What does he say? And
what's the fourth political
how
theory?
afraid are you?
Who is his daddy and what does he do?
Yeah, how afraid should we be?
Intellectually less afraid than some people might actually think. Although geopolitically, any situation where we have 9,000 nuclear weapons pointed at the rest of the world is cause for concern, right? Which isn't to
5,000.
the West. What?
5,000.
5,000. Thank you.
I looked it up recently.
That makes me feel much better, right?
Yeah.
And while we're pedantically correcting each other, it's nuclear, not nuclear. A little George Bushism there.
Yeah.
Nuclear. That can only kill everybody on the planet 3 times over. That's pretty weak.
I think like 10, but anyway, okay.
Yeah. No, I mean it's definitely a lot better. Now I'll get to know that my ashes will still persist somewhere, right? But it won't be pulverized right down to atoms.
Love the bomb, baby.
Yeah. But anyway, I want to say that I was first introduced to Dugin actually probably around 2018, particularly because of his work in Geopolitics, where in 1997 he wrote a book, Foundations of Geopolitics, which argued kind of in the same vein as Samuel Huntington, who's also referenced several times in the fourth political theory, that history was moving, because there is such a thing as history, right? He didn't think it was over, towards a kind of clash of these big global blocks, right? In this case, he argued for a kind of pan-Eurasian bloc that would confront the hegemony of Western liberal or neoconservative at the time hegemony.
And when he says pan-Eurasian, how much of Asia is included in that?
Well, that's really not something that he settles theoretically, in part because he says it has to be sorted out politically, right? But he makes the argument that, again, as you said, a lot of the Russian-speaking countries or Russian-aligned countries could probably be part of this pan-Eurasian bloc, including all the older Soviet states. Sometimes he flirts with the idea that there could be a kind of Sino-Russian alliance, right? So between China and Russia, that would obviously be pretty powerful. But it depends a lot on contingent circumstances that can't be settled immediately, right? And fair enough, right? But the thing about the book is that it really is a work on geopolitics in the sense that it's actually pretty grounded, right? In the sense that it talks about power politics, recent history, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't really have a kind of theoretical or ideological oomph to it, at least not compared to what you see in the fourth political theory, which is really intended to kind of give a philosophical gloss to a lot of his ideas. And I do want to say that he does actually confront the problems with the left-right spectrum pretty head-on. And he draws inspiration from at least 2 of the 3 great modern political theories, as he calls them. But there should be no kind of doubt about it, that he himself situates himself on the political right. He describes himself as a conservative, a traditionalist, any number of different terms, that are used somewhat interchangeably in the translation that I read.
And it's worth just quickly chiming in that traditionalism also means something more specific. We don't have to get into that, but I want to refer people to Matt and I's interview with Benjamin Teitelbaum, which we did a little while ago, where he explored capital T traditionalism. So listeners should check that out if they're curious.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like a specific thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And so, he refers to several of these terms interchangeably. There's a reason for that because, the chapters are kind of not intended to be holistically oriented in this book, right? They kind of stand on their own. And so there's sometimes different terminologies and different references used in each one. But, what kind of makes his conservatism or traditionalism interesting is its willingness to engage seriously with certain kinds of radical left ideas. But it's worth noting only those radical left ideas that he thinks are amenable to a critique of liberalism and the more permissive sides of modernity. right? So
in his mind, liberalism and neoliberalism and the expansion of, valueless Americanism, this is the great evil that's wrapping itself around the world. Is that fair to say?
Well, can we call it an evil? That itself is a question in the book. So look, I just want to say first off, I really don't like this book. Not just because I don't agree with it politically, but also because I don't think it's really all that good intellectually. One of the reasons I'm not sure that it's very good intellectually is it's kind of gleefully inconsistent in its approach to things. Now, there is a reason for that, and I'll explain it. But look, let's just make it clear, right? One of the kind of consistent themes that comes through in the book is that there are three major modern political theories, two of which Dugin respects, one of which he does not, right? The two that he respects are, broadly speaking, leftism, right? Radical leftism, in particular the Marxist tradition, or the communist tradition, however you want to call it, again, used interchangeably. The second is the fascist tradition, right? Now, there are different flavors of fascism, some of which he finds more appealing than others. And I also want to point out that he's very clear that he's not a racist fascist, right? Or he's not attracted to racist versions of fascism.
Not all fascists.
Yeah, I mean, you might think that's just absurd to say, but there's an argument for it. We can talk about it. But the one
there is a legitimate argument for that. I mean, I had to teach in an ideologies class about Mussolini and stuff and like fascism, and I think that it's true. Like we often, because Nazism so dominates our imagination of fascism, I think we do actually forget that intellectually fascism has no necessary connection to race.
And who's this Italian fascist that he always cites?
Julius Evola is the one that he cites most consistently, right? And Evola made exactly this argument that the problem with fascism, this is putting it really briefly, right, is that it's not radical enough or not radically critical of modernity.
Oh, an ever more radical theory, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? You find these trends on the right also. Because Evola's kind of point is that Nazism and eventually Italian fascism, because you're right, Victor, there was a transition, right, as Nazism became more influential, kind of gave into this crude biologism, right, where it basically ceded to modernity the idea that we should be rationalistic and scientific in our approach to things like the nation, right? And we should discriminate against people on the basis of their biological race, right? Because some are scientifically inferior and some are scientifically superior. Evola wants to have nothing to do with that, right? Because it's too crude, too materialistic, too modern, right? And Dugin's sympathetic with that, right?
I believe Dugin called the modern sciences demonic.
Yeah, I mean,
weird thing for a Satanist to say, but
yeah, and he also, I mean, so that's exactly right. So he thinks
so-called Satanist.
Your Satanism's weak, boy.
Yeah, exactly. And traditionally, I think fascism, he just sees it as too modern, right? As Matt was saying, it's too much about related to modern rationality, organizing society rationally, right, in a unified way.
I think one of the broad outlines to point to in his theory is that yes, liberalism, fascism, and communism are the three ways that modernity has specifically produced, right? And he wants his fourth way to be a kind of amalgam of what's best in postmodernism, which he really respects, and his kind of pre-modern traditionalism. So his fourth way is another one of these sort of now kind of common currency, actually, in critical theory, ways of moving beyond modernity altogether, of which sort of postmodernity since the 70s has really just been an extension of modernity and a radicalization of what modernity already created. He wants to move past that. So that's another one of the broad strokes, right? These three: fascism, communism, liberalism, they're of a piece, they're different, but they all come from the same sort of time period, beginning with the discovery of the Americas, slavery, Eurocentrism, all these sorts of historical things that have built up since the 16th century, right?
And Descartes, right? But it's worth noting again that he's willing to have a lot of good things to say about elements of fascism and elements of, this is probably what I call it, communism or Marxism, right?
Yeah.
But again, the fascist element is definitely the main one in the fourth political theory, the one that he clearly is the most sympathetic to. The elements of Marxism that he's willing to be interested in generally relate back to the critique of capitalism, right? And critiques of American and U.S. imperialism, especially recent ones.
An enemy of my enemy is his approach.
But I mean, the one that he is stridently opposed to at all costs, right? That we will never, ever offer a single concession to is liberalism, right? That's the main target that he's arguing against over the course of the book. Again, pretty inconsistently, I should say, because the reason he justifies this animosity isn't really clear. Well, it's not unclear. It's never consistently argued for. But I mean, that's the main enemy, and he sees this as being embodied in the United States, which is kind of the ultimate liberal country.
What are the main reasons that he hates liberalism? I know you said they're inconsistent, but...
Well, the reason is that the big inconsistency in the book is this, right? On the one hand, he broadly endorses a kind of relativistic approach to morality, which in and of itself is interesting because he acknowledges, like he's a smart guy, right, that this is an insight he gains from postmodern theorists like Foucault, for example, right? That we can't make an argument for universal truth claims, whether about how the world operates or the way that it should operate, right? And based on this, he makes an argument that you see a lot of conservative authors make, right? That morality, to the extent that we say it exists, is communal, right? It can be defined at the national level, at the civilizational level, maybe at the imperial level, right? But it only applies in its respective region, right? Now, one thing that you might immediately come back at is to say, well, then why doesn't liberalism just apply in its respective region, right? If these Western countries want to be liberal, then that's their morality, okay? And at some points in the book, he actually does acknowledge that. There's more kind of passive moments, right? Where he says, if the West wants to do liberalism and accept LGBTQ people and accept trans identities, that's fine.
Does he talk about that? Those things specifically?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It falls under the label of posthumanism, right? Amongst other things, right? And we can talk about that. But at other points, he makes it very clear that he's not going to be as acquiescent, that there needs to be kind of a militant pushback against liberalism by Russia or by pan-Eurasianism. And he also encourages conservative groups in the United States to try to do the same, right? And that's when he uses very morally loaded language that doesn't sound relativistic at all, right? Characterizing liberalism as evil, decayed, demonic, you pick your
word. So he does the thing that all postmodern theorists do, which is actually be crypto-normativists.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it.
He is anti-universalist. That's his thing, right? That's my understanding. His position against liberalism, and he does sort of speak favorably of some older forms of liberalism, but he is against liberal universality. So universal things like human rights is one of the things he opposes because he sees that as something that is imposed on other people. And he doesn't like that. He's down for this sort of, what you're saying, like cultural self-determination kind of idea that he picks up from postmodernists, but he also cites Boas and anthropologists and cultural relativism as well as an idea he likes to build on. But he's specifically against universalizing claims. Another thing he picks up a lot of these things from postmodernist kind of strategies, right? This is
identity politics or standpoint epistemology for fascists.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that a lot of the book makes that kind of argument, right? But then that leads you into the problem, of course, which is that if morality is just a matter of your perspective and if it's localized to certain regions, then it's very difficult for you to launch a compelling criticism of something like liberalism for reasons that he understands, right? Then you just say, well, if they want to do liberalism in the United States and Western Europe, that's fine, right? That's what they can do there. And what's also problematic, of course, is if it's the case that people in these regions believe in the universality of their doctrines, then that's just a kind of cultural perspective that they take, that their doctrines apply everywhere. Kind of hard to criticize that, right? So at other points in the book, he does appear, to use Victor's terms, to crypto-normativist, or sometimes even moralistic language.
Or even crypto-universalistic too, because if he's making these moral claims, they have to apply. Like it sounds like you're saying he makes them in a way that they sound like objective universal claims.
Yeah, exactly.
But he's saying they belong to the Eurasian people. He's arguing for morality specifically. It's not crypto-universalist.
Yeah, from their standpoint, it's ugly, it's evil, it's bad, etc. Right?
Right.
Except it's not clear how those terms are meant to be understood if they're just they just apply from that particular standpoint. And it's also worth noting that
but I just want to clarify this point because I want to make sure that I'm getting the kind of inconsistency that you're saying in the book clear. Because you're saying at some points he's like, okay, from our perspective, these things are demonic. But then, and then he wants to say, if the West wants to be liberal, they can be liberal. But then at other points in the book, you're saying it sounds like he's making claims from his standpoint that are condemning the West. But in a way that sounds like it's actually more of an objective universal claim, because otherwise he would just be like, fine, we don't agree with that, but the left can do, or the West can do what they want to do.
But universalism and normativity are not the same thing. You can make local normative claims. You can't make a local universal claim. That doesn't make sense. But you can make a normative claim that has a limited geographical or historical application, whereas you can't make a universal claim that does that, because that's what a universal is. It's a predicate that applies to everything in the collection you're talking about.
Yeah. The problem is that's clearly not the case in this book, right? Where throughout he does make claims that are very much loaded with universalistic language, that are normative claims about the ugliness, the evil, the tyranny, the danger of Western liberalism, and why it needs to be confronted both in Russia and elsewhere, right? And it's also worth noting that he goes even further than a lot of, at least the early postmodern theorists will do, by claiming that what we need is a return to theology as well, right? So there's a kind of theological dimension to this, where sometimes they'll even describe this as a kind of religious confrontation between the spiritually robust, God-fearing Russians, right?
And mysticism,
the kind of atheistic or decadent West, right? And it's very hard to kind of make an argument for the religious veracity of your point of view without appealing to some kind of universalism, which he does or universalistic language.
So you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, that he's like a conservative, but he also draws on a lot of postmodernism. I wonder if anyone's written on that.
I don't think
topic.
That's a new phrase to me.
Well, what I like about this though is like
heard of that.
It is.
Yeah.
Just going today.
What I really liked about this book, I mean, I agree, is while I was reading this, I won't lie and say that I didn't have a few moments of vindication, right? But what was interesting to me about this is what I was describing was a kind of unconscious phenomena, right? That conservatives have been stamped by features of postmodernity, whether they knew it or not, and they were agitating for these kind of politics and positions in a pomo way, right? Whereas what Dugin is doing, because Dugin is a very smart guy, right? I'm not denying that, is he's making this kind of self-conscious, right? Where he's saying, yeah, I've read Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze is a very frequent reference in the text, and he says, I'm doing that, but for these kind of conservative causes.
Yeah, he's the flip side of someone like Gramsci, who's arguing for cultural, global, capitalist hegemony, and this is our form of resistance to it. Is everything that the leftists tried, but they got killed for it.
Well,
and then now we have the right-wing mirror of that.
Yeah,
exactly. That was my point about that weird amalgam of postmodern ideas and kind of traditionalism, theological values, mysticism, traditional. It's a weird kind of melting pot of ideas he's got going.
Before we talk too much about these specific ideas, because we brought up the Putin bit, Matt, can you explain a little bit the connection? Like how this guy you're saying is evil and dangerous, but maybe not so dangerous. So what do we have to look forward to from this guy? Is he someone that Putin draws on directly, or is he kind of a useful clown for the state? What is his connection to the Ukrainian situation?
And actually, can I suggest, Matt, that maybe one of the most obvious ways into this is just to read one of those Facebook posts that Dugin made in response to Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's on Facebook and he has some juicy commentary on there about the recent situation. So feel free to look at that if you want. But
I have it in front of me if you want me to read one of them.
Yeah, please. I don't have Facebook.
Okay, so this is, I think, on the day of the invasion, and he says, "This is not a war with Ukraine. This is a confrontation with globalism as a whole planetary phenomena. Confrontation at all levels, geopolitical and ideological. Russia rejects everything in globalism. Monopolarity. Atlanticism, on the other hand, and liberalism, anti-tradition, technocracy, great reset in one word in another. It is clear that all European leaders are part of the Atlantic liberal elite, and we went to war with her. Hence, is their normal response. Russia is now being excluded from the globalist network. She has no choice anymore, either to build her world or to disappear. Russia has taken a course to build its world, its civilization, and now the first step is being taken. But in the face of globalism, only a large space, a continent state, a civilizational state can be sovereign. No country will last a complete blackout for long. Russia is now creating a field of global resistance. Her victory will be the victory of all alternative forces, both the right and the left, and all nations. As always, we begin the most difficult and dangerous processes, but when we win, we all share. That's the way it's meant to be. We are now creating the premise for true polypolarism. And those who are ready to kill us now will be the first to use our feet tomorrow. I almost always write when what then comes true, this too will come to pass.
That's seductive. Victor, now you put me
like
on
a
the
prophet.
You put me on the fascist pipeline. Thanks.
Well, this is why I've never liked postmodernism, because I think it opens the door to this.
Opens the door. Yeah, so we should just close our eyes and believe liberal modernity is the best we've ever had or ever will have it.
Yeah, and I want to note, one of the things that I was reminded of when I was reading Dugin's book is a point Terry Eagleton made in his book, The Illusions of Postmodernism, where he says a lot of these people on the left who invoke things like particularity, anti-universalism, anti-liberalism, forget that these actually had their root in conservative thinking. People like Edmund Burke or Joseph de Maistre.
Well, before you go on with that, though, I do just on the quote, I was wondering if maybe, I think it's important to define this whole talk about polarity, polarism. Yeah. So. Okay,
so look, I mean, this is something that's consistently a major theme in his work, right? Because again, Dugin is interdisciplinary. Let's just put it that way. So he's not just a political theorist. He really is concerned about everything from the movies people watch to practical geopolitics. You could almost see him as a kind of dark Slavoj Žižek that way, if you want also, right? There's nothing that he won't talk about, right? But the basic idea is that strategically and culturally, there is a kind of problem with the world order as it's existed since 1989 or 1992, right? Which is that we live in a unipolar world, one where there's one superpower or hyperpower, as he puts it in the book, the United States. And it gets to essentially set the agenda for the rest of the world. And while there can be some kind of deviations from U.S. soft or light imperialism in countries like Iran or North Korea, they don't really have an awful lot of force. And the countries that try to stand outside of the U.S. imperial order are considered bad, rogue states, the axis of evil, whatever you want to call it. So he's making an argument that strategically, what you need is an alignment of culturally and politically illiberal countries that can serve as a kind of bloc that's sufficiently powerful to confront U.S. and, broadly speaking, liberal or Western hegemony, right? And he isn't always very sensitive to the vast differences between different flavors of illiberalism, right? The reality is, I would say that Chinese socialism Chinese characteristics, or third way socialism or authoritarianism, whatever you want to call it, right, is very different from what you see with Putinism, right? But again, the argument is that if all these people align and you get enough of them, we'll be able to confront the West and provide a resource for people who want to confront its decadence within those countries. So
this polarity then is another way, as a kind of geopolitical way of describing what philosophically he wants, as you said, inconsistently, but he wants there to be like room for different value systems to exist in the world. So whereas right now he feels like the liberal view is dominating with America and the West. And so in that sense, it's unipolar geopolitically and culturally. And I think you're saying that, so the geopolitical way of describing that is multipolarity, right? So he wants to build where there are several legitimate kind of value systems that coexist in the world.
Yeah, and he draws on a number of different authors from across the political spectrum to make this argument, right? I mean, again, one of them is Samuel Huntington, who's critical of. Huntington was famous for making this class of civilizations argument in 1997, right? Where he argues that, look, different civilizational blocks could theoretically serve as a kind of counterweight to the hegemony of the West. But he also does draw on some leftist criticisms of the United American hegemony as well, particularly in the Marxist tradition, by arguing that illiberalism can be conflated with anti-capitalism, and then maybe you could align some anti-capitalist states into this block as well, right? It's a fairly open-ended kind of project, right? The only thing you need for membership, if you want to put it this way, really crudely, is to be illiberal, right? If you look at the LGBTQ lifestyle and something in you thinks that's wrong and it should be put a stop to, congratulations, you might be a country that can be in Dugin's illiberal bloc.
So, again, I wanted to reiterate my question. Is Putin listening to this guy, or is he a mouthpiece for an actual project, or is he just an esoteric, eccentric, publishing weird books and meeting with Steve Bannon?
No, I mean, like Victor, I don't want to be unicausal, right? There can be this temptation on the part of philosophers.
This
to
is a
say that
podcast. We don't want nuance. We want the hot takes.
Yeah, I'm going to give it. So, look, I mean, there's this kind of temptation that people like Heidegger will fall into, and Dugin is the same way, which is to say, ultimately, the ideas are what's determinative of the world. So Dugin will sit there and write his book in 1997, and whether the people at the top actually know it, sooner or later they'll be influenced by ideas and they'll implement them, right?
Well, he does have some sort of an official position in the Kremlin, does he not?
He does. Yeah,
Some-
in
at
Russian
some title?
society.
And he's also maybe or was he still at Moscow State University or whatever? I'm not sure.
I think
Yeah,
he
that
got
was
kicked
my
out of there,
understanding.
didn't he?
Well,
Recently.
maybe he got.
Yeah. So, look, I mean, again, I'm trying not to be unicausal in the sense of saying that Dugin basically determined.
I thought we said that
Who's-
nuance wasn't allowed here. Okay, but let me just quickly say though that I think it's hard to. I guess the direct answer, I think, to Pills's question is that like it's hard to know how much influence Dugin actually has on Putin. I don't know. I haven't read all the literature on it, but my understanding is like some people think that yeah they talk all the time and he believes it. Other people think that Putin just sees this guy Dugin talking about Eurasianism, which kind of roughly maps on to like Putin's fixation with wanting to have more influence geopolitically to be relevant, right? I think ultimately Putin sees how Russia used to be so relevant with the USSR, and now they were kind of falling into irrelevance. So I think he sees this philosopher talking about stuff, and he's like, oh yeah, like this is an argument for us to be relevant again.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know. I mean, I actually rewatched the Putin interviews from 2016. You know, Oliver Stone interviewed Putin for like 4 hours over several different days. And because I was just fascinated to kind of like get a refresher on what Putin's like. And my impression from that is like, I don't know how philosophically sophisticated Putin is. I don't really think he necessarily is.
Yeah. probably.
My hunch would be that he would not understand Dugin's books, but he has a geopolitical interest in and some vague notion that Russia needs to be relevant again. So maybe that's just like, kind of, they have interests that coincide enough so that they can be like kind of like pointing in the same direction. But I doubt like Putin actually like understands the philosophy. That's
that's what I was going to say, right? Again, trying to avoid being unicausal. I don't think that Dugin influenced Putin to be the way that he is, right? This is just me speculating, right? Because I'm not privy to what's going on in the Kremlin, at least not yet, right? I think, though, that Dugin is a convenient ideological mouthpiece for a lot of Putin's ideas, who can provide a kind of theoretical justification that's appealing to a lot of people, not just in Russia, but outside of Russia, people like Millerman, right? And you can sometimes see echoes of Dugin's arguments in the kind of rhetoric that Putin will use, because a very consistent point that comes through in all of his work is this idea that the West is hypocritical, right? Because on the one hand, it makes an argument for universal human rights, respecting national sovereignty, being sensitive to cultural difference, right? While on the other hand, trying to impose its kind of monological liberalism and capitalism across the globe, right? And often doing so by imperial means. And
he's
Putin doesn't
absolutely right about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no doubt that he's
Neither
absolutely right.
new nor controversial is that idea.
Yeah, no, he's absolutely right about that. But what's unique about this is, again, you'll often see Putin bringing up this fact to accuse the West of hypocrisy whenever somebody points out that Russia is now engaging in these kind of imperialistic projects and trying to export its national ideology through the invasion of Ukraine, through invasions in Georgia, through kind of interfering with the politics
and installing puppet governments.
Yeah, or in Belarus. Yeah, exactly, right? And, he says, basically, you're doing it, we're doing the same thing, except we're doing it better because, we're doing it in favor of the right ideology. And people in Russia love that, right? Because he's seen as sticking up for the West. Now, as an argument, it's bunk, right? Because saying, you did it, so now we get to do it also, is the kind of morality or the ethos that children take, right? But it does have some political credibility to it. So it wouldn't surprise me, again, if maybe he skims over Dugin's works, picks up on these kinds of arguments, and then articulates them.
And he does talk about, you do hear Putin say stuff about like multi-polarity and unipolarity. I mean that idea, as Matt mentioned, with like Samuel Huntington and stuff. I mean, I think that language has been around in kind of like geopolitical geopolitics for a while. So that's not, unique to Dugin, but Dugin gives it some philosophical kind of underpinnings. But Matt, I was curious. I think one thing that might be important, and since we've covered Heidegger before on the podcast, I think it would be interesting to ask, like, what role does Heidegger play for Dugin?
He plays a foundational role for him, although again, that's only in certain chapters. Okay, so the best way to describe this book would be: imagine that Deleuze and Guattari did an awful lot of crack cocaine, moved to Russia and decided to become fascists and rewrite 1,000 Plateaus, right? You get something that looked a little bit like the Fourth Political Theory, because it's not a book or a holistic book in the sense that we would understand it, right? Where you kind of start with an introduction, you move through the various chapters and subject matters, and then you reach a conclusion, right? Each chapter can kind of stand on its own, and he makes theoretical observations about a wide variety of different traditions, some of which he likes and some of which he doesn't, and doesn't make it too much of an effort of trying to say how this all fits together, right? And by the way, this isn't me speculating. He says that's what he's going to do, right? That he's engaging in this kind of playful Pomo reading of a lot of these figures. So when it comes to somebody like Heidegger, he's obviously on the right side of history, pun intended, right? Because he has this argument for the authenticity of a collective Dasein, right? That he makes in the 1930s, right? This idea that the nation state can express itself authentically if it has the right leaders and if it breaks from the decadence and inauthenticity of modernity. And obviously he's extremely attracted to this, and he calls it a kind of revolutionary conservatism, right? A conservatism that doesn't just want to kind of hold back modernity or compromise with modernity, but wants to overthrow it wholesale in the name of a kind of national identity. Now, obviously, he points out that Heidegger also didn't go far enough, because he kind of lapsed into supporting the Nazi Party with this crude biological racism. So bad for him, right? So you could see Dugin's project, at least in the chapters where he's talking about it, as an attempt to kind of do this 1930s Heidegger project right, to get it right this time.
And he appeals to the concept of Dasein to kind of ground his sort of moral relativism, right? It's because he wants to say that there are different Daseins, right?
Or rootedness.
Well, this
Exactly.
is the most Nazi Heidegger got was probably the speech, the rectorship speech, and there he talks very much about the ground, the rootedness, connection to the earth, the Volk. And that sounds like something being reproduced here in another language, obviously.
No, absolutely. And just like in that speech, you see Heidegger sometimes gesture to elements of liberalism without ever calling it that by talking about the importance of freedom. So too do you see Dugin talk a lot about freedom, but real freedom or authentic freedom in this text, right? The freedom of the nation state to express its true design. But it's interesting that he also sometimes has a bit more of a Nietzschean flavor to some of his work as well, because he says that the problem is that liberalism has always focused on equal freedom for all, by which he means kind of equal permissiveness for all, right? The right of everybody to choose what kind of ice cream flavor they want to eat or to fuck whoever they want, right? Which, by the way, I endorse. Since I'm apparently the horniest philosopher of the group. That's that person in our chat said. But anyway, but Dugin says that the kind of freedom that's not allowed by liberalism is the freedom of superior people or people with more imagination or creativity to engage in these kind of grand projects of political or self-overcoming, whether individually or collectively. And this kind of freedom can only happen if you have something approximating an authoritarian society where people can use others as clay for these kind of grandiose projects. Now, he never quite explains what he means by this or how authoritarian we can get, but it's clear that there's a kind of echo of Nietzscheanism that you find in Heidegger and now in Dugin, with this fixation on greatness, or at least spectacular projects.
And unlike Nietzsche and Heidegger, he endorses, I think specifically Orthodox Christianity, but not because you should believe anything about Christianity. It's because you need some sort of social glue to bring the Volk or the people together to make them have this coherent project.
Yeah, I mean, again, nobody's going to read this book and accuse him of an excess of consistency, because you might think if we're going to be epistemic skeptics, not just about normative universals, but about knowledge claims generally, then how do we know about God? But the argument is a functional one, right? That theology has served Russia well, or a kind of Russian orthodoxy has served Russia well as a glue that's not only held society together, which is again a kind of functional argument, but more importantly, it's oriented Russians towards these kind of spiritually great or invigorating projects, right? Rather than just focusing on satisfying material needs, they focused on these grand spiritual and religious enterprises, right? And he's attracted to that. And, he's not the only person on the far right to sometimes vacillate between a kind of Nietzschean attraction to atheistic great projects and a kind of admiration of spiritual or religious great projects, right? The one thing that's constant through all these vacillations is that whether you're an atheist Nietzschean or kind of or Heideggerian or a kind of Russian spiritualist, you're illiberal, right? You do not buy into liberalism, and you buy into something that's more appealing and more deep than liberalism.
There it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, intellectually, the book is, maybe this is going to make me sound a lot like an analytical philosopher and like a liberal theorist. It's not very good, right? It's all over the place. And there's really no effort to try to paper over the intense contradictions within it. But I think Dugin would say that the demand that he do so is itself reflective of a kind of liberal mentality.
That was actually what I was going to say next, is why are you harping so much on consistency as if consistent ideas are the ones that win?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what he'd say, right? That I'm not interested in things like consistency or rationality, at least in the liberal sense of the word. I'm interested in these kind of creative, intuitive, dynamic projects that will help thinking break out of its boxes and lead people down the course.
Also, showing you why you think your consistent worldview, your consistent liberal worldview is actually very inconsistent kind of point, I guess, too.
Sure.
So I'm curious, does it make the two co-hosts who are a little bit more sympathetic to postmodernism, are you guys finding this super appealing, or are you guys going to become Duginites?
I'm finding this dangerously seductive.
Yeah.
You are,
Yeah.
aren't you?
I can't speak for Eric, of course, but Dugin is reacting to the same thing we do, more so than you libs. And that is the pervasive attitude on the part of mostly everyone who has a stake in this system. And the stakeholders who control politicians through donations, who can afford to pay the salaries of mouthpieces in the mainstream media. And the attitude of them, liberals generally, is an unabashed smugness about the totality of their fantasies about the world. Yeah, okay, we invaded Iraq and that was bad, but it was just a miscalculation, but it doesn't really matter anyway because Iraq was not free. So Iraqis, of course, are outside of history, miscalculation on our part, and this comes out from liberals not just philosophically, but the way this is intermixed with ever-expanding capitalist interests, that they make history, their morality is real morality, and will never make anything new. Will never let you have something new. So you stupid little leftists, and you stupid little protesters, and you stupid little Deleuzians, why are you even trying? History, if it's not over, as some of them say, but if history is not over, then it's our business. History is liberal business, literally. And anyone outside of that, Iran, China, Russia, we're going to sanction you and make the lives of ordinary people a living hell, just unbearable, because, again, they don't get a stake in our story. They don't get a stake in the grand narrative. So I'm sympathetic to leftism insofar as it is opposed to that smugness, that this thing is rotten with a pretty face. And that happens to be the same thing that Dugin argues for. So the rest of the shit is pretty scary, admittedly, but I have no difficulty, no trouble understanding the appeal of this line of thinking at all.
I do. I guess the best analogy for this is probably, I'll get to it. It's kind of a weird thing to see somebody who draws on all the same thinkers that I respect and does something different. It's like, I want to use all these thinkers, postmodernists. I like what he reads, right? He talks about Deleuze and Foucault and Derrida, and he talks about pragmatists like Peirce and James and Dewey, and he approves of them as well. And it, like, the best analogy I can think of is like, we're working with the same material, but whereas I want to build a nuclear power plant. He wants to build a nuclear weapons facility. And they're very similar things, but they have very different functions in the end now, don't they? One of them is to help people, and the other one is to fuck people up. And that's just what I feel like. They're both made of the same shit. They both look the same, but they're very fucking different. And that's the best analogy I can think of, because it's jarring to see somebody who lines up. Like he said his favorite postmodern philosopher is Bruno Latour.
Hey,
and he mentioned he really
your
likes
boy.
that book, We Have Never Been Modern, right? Because it fits right in with this whole thing, right? Like anti-modern. That's the basic position he has. He's an anti-modernist, and he sees fascism, liberalism, communism, all coming from the modern period. So he likes this book, We Have Never Been Modern, where Latour argues that modernity, or what Latour calls the modern settlement, was this sort of like resolution between scientists represented by Robert Boyle, and philosophers represented by Hobbes. And they said, you can have your section and we'll call that nature. And you politicians, you can have your ontological division of the world and we'll call that culture. And then the modernist settlement was born, and here we are today with this sort of dualistic worldview, mind, body, subject, object. And he brings up these sorts of and I think they're very good arguments. They're very, very keyed into what modernity is all about. But again, he wants to build a weapons facility, and I would rather build something that's a little more useful than that.
So what accounts for that difference, right? So like, doesn't that mean that you need to actually just like take a leap and make a normative claim for like why you prefer the power plant over the weapons facility?
Yeah, well,
Victor.
I'm not opposed to normativity, right? You know, like,
But he's trying to do a gotcha. No, normativity is not something that's precluded by postmodernism. What postmodernism is interested in is, how did we get this normativity? Where does the normativity get built? How over time do we get to normative claims?
Peirce calls aesthetics, ethics, and philosophy the normative sciences. That's what they're designed to do. Whenever you hold a belief about something, all beliefs are normative, right? A belief is what you would do if this situation would arise. That is by definition normative. Humans and all animals contain normativity and generality within them, right? It's not a big fucking deal unless you're kind of like a radical particularist brought up on a diet of only Derrida, and then maybe, I don't know. But
do you think that there's a way in which like Dugin is somehow deciding by using kind of his like, you know, anti-modern, anti kind of like logocentric, rationalistic view to then say, well, because I can clear the space of all these like imposing scientific kind of claims, like normative claims that are like pretending to be based on reason, then now from that standpoint, you can be like, yeah, actually, we do have a Russian culture. I'm choosing to say Russian culture where we can exclude gay people, exclude trans people, exclude, and build what we want. It's
and 17-year-old boys to die.
And and then so how do you, so I guess it's like, so what protects us then? It's like we need something to protect us from that if we're going to use all these same philosophers to say, no, these philosophers actually are about you know, there should be some principle to lead us to inclusion or something.
But then that's the thing, right? Are we going to go with the noble lie in that case? Then is that the normative claim you're looking for? We need a noble lie, which may be completely false, like all humans are equal.
Liberalism.
Whether or not that's true or false, that's the noble thing, probably a lie that we're going to go with, right? And then you get back into this whole problem of, again, Platonism, which Dugin likes. He loves Platonists, right? He's
Neoplatonism.
Yeah, he's into that shit too. So you're right back in Dugin's arena again, and you got to then now normative claim yourself out with a different lie. It's like he's lying about one thing. I want to lie about something different.
Just become liberals. It's great, guys.
Just because
It is, it's fantastic.
The reason that
Open a
this is not
McDonald's.
liberal is because
Philosophical
just
liberals.
believing in something like universal human rights doesn't make universal human rights exist on a justified philosophical ground. That's why you need the lie.
No, well, here, what I want to
Lies are true.
What I want to say is that I think the thinker who is most consistent on this basis, and is somebody that he relies on quite a bit in the book, not as much as some other people, is somebody like Deleuze, right? Because when you read Derrida's work or you read the work of somebody like Michel Foucault, they're pretty insistent that their work is intended to be interpreted for radical purposes, radical left purposes. or in Derrida's case, kind of soft radical left purposes. Deleuze was the only one I could think of who was honest enough, and Guattari in Thousand Plateaus, to say, look, we're not sitting there saying be rhizomatic, right? Because rhizomatic thinking might be more democratic, it might be more inclusive, it might be more hyper-modern, to use Dugin's term, but it can also mean microfascism emerging, right? Or neo-fascism, or traditionalism of that sort, right? And there is no barrier that we can put up to those kind of things on the basis of our way of thinking about it. And Dugin, in some senses, seems to have taken up that challenge to say, fine, I am going to do a kind of rhizomatic traditionalism from a Russian standpoint. And am I surprised by that? No. Do I think it's interesting? Yes. Do I think it needs to be confronted and destroyed at every single level where possible? Yes, I also think that. Because I think the world that he's arguing for is a horrifying one. And that doesn't mean that liberalism is without tremendous flaws, and modernity is without tremendous flaws. But as both a liberal and a socialist, I think that we need to have a big no to this way of thinking about things.
Mm-hmm. I think what makes us different, too, is I'm not a Canadian philosopher.
And Victor, I know you were saying this kind of tongue-in-cheek, but saying, well, just become a liberal and reassert those values. No, the correct response to this would be, you have to overcome him aesthetically, which means you have to be more interesting than Dugin. So fuck consistency, just be more interesting.
Be more interesting. That could work too. Yeah. I mean,
that's part of the danger, right? Because, every state has its ideology, its philosophy, its state philosophers kind of thing. Every state has that. And, in combination with some kind of political agenda or geopolitical strategy, right? The spearhead of those strategies is always going to be an ideological front. That's how it works, right? You got to get the justification out there ahead of the front lines, and then hopefully you can neutralize some of the opposition, get certain people on your side. Every state does this. This is just a reality. This is a real politic reality that happens. And he's doing it for Russia. And what makes us different is that I am not claiming that Canada is some fallen empire that needs to be restored, and I'm going to do it with Charles Sanders Peirce and Felix Guattari. That's not my claim. That's sort of Dugin's claim about Russia, right? So it kind of puts his ideas in line with a certain kind of political agenda. So as well as he presents his ideas, as appealing as they seem, and the nice sort of friendly veneer he puts on his interviews, where he doesn't it's just like watching Jordan Peterson, right? It's like I don't disagree with everything he says, but it's sort of the spirit in which it's presented that puts me off a little bit. And that's the same thing with Dugin here, is that he's not saying anything that's like wrong or controversial. I mean, when you get down into the sort of, and like looking for the analytic points where he contradicts himself, okay, there you go. And you could desire some more detail. But in the end, it's the proximity of his ideas to a certain geopolitical strategy that probably makes them the most dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I think right now what we're seeing too is, I was going to say, like, bringing it back to the perspective of Ukraine, I think that if that quote, If the Duginites think that what Putin is doing right now is like fulfilling that, I mean, it kind of seems to me like it's backfiring, because like if this sort of like Western identity was the thing that needs to be overcome, it's like it might have been better strategy to just sit back and watch the West keep internally quibbling over like nonsense, like mask mandates, and like let it kind of like decay from its own decadence. But instead, the best thing you can do for like a cultural like block or whatever is to give it an enemy. And I think that's really what Putin just did.
Yeah, I agree.
And all prophecies need believers, right? And the more believers, the more self-fulfilling the prophecy will be. If it's the fall of the West, then the more people who believe that's going to happen, is more likely it is to happen.
Yeah,
and I really, it's too bad that we might have to wrap up soon, because I spent actually quite a bit of time reading through Michael Millerman's paper because Michael Millerman was tweeting when all of this was happening. He was tweeting about Dugin, subsequently ended up deleting them. I don't know, maybe because he got I think he pulls himself into controversial discourse. But I read one of his papers that was posted on his academia.edu page that he was posting, kind of being like, if you want to know what Dugin's about, like, read this if you want to understand, right? If you want to understand the views. And I think like what was interesting about the paper that I wanted to quickly touch on is just the way that Millerman is kind of trying to defend Dugin from these accusations that he's a fascist, or that that he's and what's interesting about the paper is he describes Dugin's view, but then he ends up saying, like, basically he's making these arguments on what to me seem like technicalities, to be like, see, he's not technically a fascist because he wants to go beyond fascism. And I'm just like, how is this an argument defending Dugin? It's just like, so like he does three things, right? So he says, because fascism is actually a modernist view, he can't be fascist. So calling him a fascist is stupid. I'm like, so like what matters is like what Dugin is actually advocating for, which is terrifying. It's not whether he's
sounds like a duck, walks like a duck.
Yeah, whether he's technically a fascist or not. And people know that in the past I've kind of argued about how stupid it is, how like the term fascism can be just used pejoratively, kind of like for anti-intellectual means. And like I'm sympathetic to that. Like it's true. Like it makes more sense to see what Dugin is actually saying than to just call him a fascist. But when you see what he's actually saying, it's fucking crazy. Okay. And then the other thing that he does, which is kind of interesting, is he says, like people say that he wants a bipolar world, and it's like he actually wants a multipolar world. And it's like, okay, again, he's like, the whole paper is like fixated on little technicalities. But then my favorite one was, he's like, oh, a lot of people say that he's trying to recapture some lost unity. It's like a retrograde conservative view. But it's like, no, that assumes a unidirectional account of time. But really, Dugin has a, what does he say? Has a synchronic view of time. So it's actually like cyclical.
Yeah, he's been reading his Wolfgang Pauli.
So if you understood that it's actually cyclical time, then you would see that you're wrong to say that he's retrograde because he wants to go beyond. So it's just like funny that he thinks that these arguments over like the kind of philosophical minutia is somehow like a substantive defense of Dugin. I mean, he claims this is really just a defense of like, read Dugin so you understand what he's saying. And like that point I would agree with. Like if you want to know what he's saying, you should read him or spend a little bit, like some time making an effort to read him. But it's just like when he says, oh, he's misunderstood, it's like, okay, all you're showing me is like a misunderstanding of these like little philosophical points. But I think what people are actually interested in substantively is like, what's the way the world Dugin wants? What is the way that Dugin wants the world to be? And do we find that normatively appealing or not? And
but isn't this kind of what,
that's to me the bottom line.
Of what Matt is doing here a little bit by saying that, don't worry everyone, his arguments are inconsistent. But the consistency we've decided is something that doesn't matter, because if he has on his backing up his ideas, the Russian army, say, then it doesn't matter whether they're consistent or not.
That's fair.
What I'm saying is that we shouldn't worry too much about it from a purely intellectual standpoint. Ideologically.
Who worries about anything from a purely intellectual standpoint?
Yeah. I also want to say, ideologically, what I think is terrifying is that I can completely see why this would be appealing. I also want to say that Millerman himself seems to misinterpret Dugin, because he didn't argue for a synchronic view or even a cyclical view of time, but a pluralistic view of time, right? There are many different ways of understanding time that are appropriate in many different circumstances, right? But I mean, that's kind of pedantic in of itself. And I agree with what you said, Victor. Sitting there and defending a fascist or a neo-fascist by saying he's not for race biologism and racial fascism and racial chauvinism, but for ethnic chauvinism and ethnic authoritarianism instead. It's kind of like, well, great. That'll ease me when I'm terrified to sleep at night.
Well, he's also interested in fascism in the if it is fascism, it's a type that is non-rational, right? Because I do take, there is a substantive point to be made to say that like classical fascism is still a kind of rationalistic political theory, right? Because it's like about rationally organizing the society along certain kinds of like, collective goals with an authoritarian organization at the top. And I think that he would be saying that Dugin is not doing that because he opposes that kind of rationalistic reasoning.
It's a kind of irrationalist.
It's a kind of irrationalist way with mysticism and all that stuff, right?
In that sense, Dugin is actually in some ways less innovative than the classical fascism. And I mean that, with big scare quotes, because he kind of just wants to go back to the good old days of conservative authoritarianism when it comes to his domestic approach to politics. Whereas at least the fascists tried to innovate in their own kind of warped and evil way when it came to how to conceive the state and what the objectives of the state are going to be. Because one of the things that Dugin insincerely claims is that he's interested in experimentalism throughout the course of life, that he wants each nation state, civilization, empire to be kind of an experiment and have its own viewpoint, have its own way of doing things, and that they shouldn't be interfered with.
It's appealing to the old American democratic experiment there.
Yeah, except my argument would be that he arbitrarily decides that they should only apply at the nation state or civilization level, but not to individuals. Because, of course, John Stuart Mill would make exactly the same kind of argument that each life should be conceived as an experiment. Individualism is the best way to get the most kind of pluralistic viewpoints out there in the world. And Dugin says, no, we should have homogeneity, or relative homogeneity at the nation state level, because it's each nation state or civilization that's supposed to be an experiment, not each individual, because that's decadent, materialistic, and a symptom of decline. And I also want to point out that this kind of Millsian viewpoint is very much in line with what Marx and a genuine socialist tradition argued. In the third volume of Das Kapital, Marx says that the beauty of a socialist society will be that for the first time in human history, the amplification of human powers will be an end in itself, not amplification for the purposes of production, but for its own sake, right? And that's what I would like to see. The amplification of everyone's individual human powers, not the amplification of the powers of a brutal authoritarian nation state that's invading its neighbor and won't even allow the citizens of that nation state to express their own design by criticizing people like Aleksandr Dugin and Vladimir Putin. Anyway.
Dugin says the individual is a social construct.
Facts, bitch.
Yeah.
Well,
doesn't he explicitly kind of prioritize? I think he explicitly prioritizes the collective over the individual.
Yeah, that's
Dugin's.
his sort of chosen level of analysis. Yeah.
Except it is really chosen, right? He just arbitrarily says at one point, individualism is a social construct, which is true, right? You can talk about the invention of the notion of individualism from the 16th century onward. Except he says, we will buy into any number of different social contracts, the nation state level, the civilizational level, but I'm not going to buy into individualism because of reasons, right? And it's kind of like
too liberal.
Really? Yeah, like what an argument.
He's really owning the libs.
Yeah, it's I kind of want to touch on something you said earlier, Pills, about because it was tongue in cheek when I said just become a liberal. But I do think there's but I think it's interesting what you said. Because to be more interesting, like that should be the goal. I guess what I would say about that is, I think what I'm seeing there is kind of like your artistic bias coming through, right? I think when it comes to political, like organizing a society. Politically, I don't know if people in their day-to-day life are really looking for things to be maximally interesting. I think they're looking for some consistency so that they can get on with their life and like do the things that matter to them, as opposed to, them being surrounded by all this interesting stuff, eruptions going on all around them. I don't know if most people want that.
Yeah, and isn't it like the whole obsession with Dugin for somebody outside of Russia would be like a product of modern technology, communications, and globalism, right? Because how else would you hear about this obscure philosopher from the other end of the world unless you had this global network in the first place to get that kind of information to you? And yeah, you're right. People are concerned with consistency in their everyday lives and reliability and those sorts of things. So to become obsessed with this sort of thing, if you're not like a professional scholar or academic or political scientist, to even pay attention to these sorts of things is already a kind of, I don't know, a strange thing that seems to go against exactly what Dugin is saying. He's like, hey, let's not be globalists, but pay attention to what I'm saying, me, this person on the other side of the planet who you'd only hear about because of modern technology and social media. He just kind of leans on things that are outside the text. I know I shouldn't say that there is an outside of the text, but there is one, and he leans on them heavily. That sort of thing, the globalism that he denounces. He also leans pretty heavily on conspiracy theories about globalist elites and stuff like that, and he like owns that pretty much too. But there's a certain lack of maybe trying to evaluate the purposes of his project and what he's doing, and the ideas are appealing, yeah, and like whatever, but like what's the end game for it all? It's a kind of Russian expansionism countering a NATO expansionism, neither of which are a good thing, but two wrongs don't make a right.
I mean, I prefer NATO expansionism. I mean, you know, I get the point about it being like imperialistic in its own way, but
Well, of course you prefer that to you for you because you're sitting in NATO.
Yeah, of course I do.
What's
but I
so
also
good
think
about lining up nuclear weapons on the borders of countries that don't do business with us or that would do things we don't like? Like, that's not a great thing either. And
I mean, I
that's
agree
what
with you.
NATO
So, like,
does.
but I mean, that seems like a step. So, I think like, I think I want to resist. Like, I think there is some kind of like effort on some people's part to make kind of like a moral equivalence between like what. I mean, I'm not saying that you're doing that, between like what like a Putinism is kind of trying to do versus like NATO. I mean, NATO in itself. So it's important to distinguish between like NATO as a treaty, as a defensive treaty, versus American imperialism, stuff that they did during the 20th century, like invading and installing puppet regimes that were like pro-capitalist.
20th century.
Like, that's separate. Well, okay, I mean, whatever. Recently, I'm just
yeah. Recently, they left Afghanistan. NATO left Afghanistan like 6 months ago.
I'm just saying there's a difference between like NATO as a defensive treaty versus like the stuff that America has done kind of clandestinely.
Well, you mean nominally defensive.
I didn't say nominally.
I did.
Oh, I mean, it's nominally defensive. I mean, in the sense that there's not going to be like any first strike coming from NATO.
Sure, okay, they won't shoot missiles first, but they will rig your elections with well-funded pro-Western candidates and then embargo the shit out of you if you have the audacity to elect anyone hostile to those Western capital interests.
I mean, even look at the difference with what America and the British did in World War II, right? They pushed the Nazis back, and then they gave the countries back to the population. What did the USSR do? They pushed in. They kept everything that they invaded. I mean, so there's just like two different ways of approaching that. And like one to me seems clearly morally better than the other.
God damn, you gotta give me some of what you're drinking. $1 billion of Marshall Plan money was given to the CIA, which were transferred to local law enforcement in Europe to just kill leftists.
I mean, I'm not saying that you know, there's not things that are morally questionable. I just don't think they're the same. I think it's worth making the distinction between like what are the two tendencies of like whatever the former USSR and how they've handled their form of imperialism versus like, I don't know, the NATO alliance, which is kind of like you know, a pseudo voluntary, like capitalistic. I mean, obviously stuff that America did was not voluntary, right? They were like, you know, influencing clandestinely states, but I just think there's a difference there.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a middle course to be run between all of this sort of, you know, everything with liberalism is rainbows and sunshine. Everything with capitalism is fucking like atrocious and disgusting for people. Like, I mean, there's certainly a middle course to be run between those two things. And I don't think the answer to, you know, the world being in a really shitty state, rampant inequality, exploitation, and all that stuff, I don't think the answer is to just like jump ship onto some nut job Russian mystics philosophy and start doing that sort of thing. I don't think the answer is that.
No,
but I mean, the fact that it's appealing shows you that there's a lot of discontent out there with the current status quo.
That's true. I mean, I don't find it appealing at all, but maybe some people do. Maybe you and Pills do a little bit. At least there's some mild appeal.
Yeah, well, he deals with ideas that I'm very familiar with, but they come in a form and a packaging that I'm somewhat unfamiliar with. I guess you could say. Like, I can't just divine everything Dugin's about because he knows the same philosophers that I do. I still have to read him and figure out what he's all about, how he's constructing his arguments and what they're doing, and then obviously the geopolitical context that they're sort of blowing up in right now. That's all important stuff that add to the texts too, right? Not the text isn't just this isolated thing you read and then you get these ideas from it. They're embedded in a context. That's what I'm trying to say. But it's difficult to evaluate just on the basis of his ideas alone, because a lot of them aren't really that new, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think, you know, all these stories about NATO, this, and I mean, yeah, sure, some people, you can interpret NATO expansion as a form of aggression, but I also think it's just as reasonable to believe that without NATO, a lot of these Baltic states would all have kind of Putinist puppet governments. I think that like NATO is a big disincentive from Putin doing his funny business where he, you know, assassinates people, poisons people, and installs puppet governments. So I can understand the incentive of a Baltic country or a Balkan country to be like, I want to be part of NATO because then Putin can't fuck with us.
Yeah,
right?
and you can't. I mean, this is part of the problem with the conversation about it too. Is like you said earlier, jumping to causal explanations, and I would add to justifications. Right, like NATO expansionism is obviously an important aspect of the history of setting up the conditions for this situation. But then people want to jump and say that's a cause or that's a justification of the situation. That's not good historian work. Then you're leaving the realm of explanation and going into personal opinion, which is fine. But you know, it's not. You just got to be aware that it's probably incorrect and much more complicated than that. Which is a shitty answer, but that's fucking life, right? If it ain't complicated, then it's probably bullshit.
There's no reason to think, I guess. Also, that argument is often premised on, oh, like if NATO hadn't expanded, then like Russia would just be keeping to itself and not fucking with any of its countries. Like that clearly doesn't seem right to me. Like if NATO wasn't around, it seems at least as reasonable to assume that they would be just as incentivized, if not more incentivized, to fuck with their former Soviet countries.
Well, these liberal philosophers, like the ones in the room here, they're just going to defend the NATO status quo, whereas Dugin is going to defend the Russian status quo. But in the end, your opinions don't really make a difference to the situation in any case. You're just providing
That's
justification for one side or for the other.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also important to look at, you know, like countries from the global south and why they're so hesitant to get involved in the situation or like openly condemn the Russian invasion. And it's not because they don't think it's wrong. I mean, there is the cases where they're allies of Russia, like Venezuela. They don't want to say anything to antagonize their friends. But there's also the important point where a lot of them feel that the U.S. led NATO and the EU and the United Nations, they all created this situation. It's their fault, not intentionally, but they created this situation and that they should take some responsibility for it, right? And that they don't want to get involved because they see that this is part of some kind of U.S. agenda in order to, you know, save face after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan or some other sort of thing, right? America perceiving itself, especially after Trump, as no longer being, you know, the world power. They're still kind of the world power, but, you know, not as much as they used to be. Some people see in this situation just the kind of US-led way of trying to gain credibility again, and they don't really want to be a part of that, especially if they have a history with the US, fucking with them and extracting their resources and giving them nothing back kind of thing. And I mean, again, it's a complicated situation, but it's never been unipolar or bipolar in the first place. That should be the title of a book we write. We have never been bipolar or something like that, right? That would be a better title for a new Latourian book, because I think this whole unipolar, bipolar, multipolar thing
that's really what he wants, allegedly.
Kind of ridiculous. And it's, you know, you could read Guattari, get the same argument out of him. It's this left-right bipolarity is bullshit. We need more centers of political thought. We need more than just a spectrum that has two ends to it. And, you know, like we need up, down, left, and right, and diagonals as well, right? We can't have, and we do have that, but they're all organized around liberal or conservative. And then sometimes you add the other axes of power or truth, but that doesn't solve anything. But you get that same argument. Like I said, Dugin's ideas are not new. Some of them are quite familiar, but the packaging and the sort of way they're being presented is a lot different, I'd say.
Well, the way they're being justified, right?
Yeah.
Is new. It's like
purposes, how they're being deployed. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if there's any other philosopher because most people who use the philosophers he likes are obviously arguing for some form of like socialism or anarchism or something obviously more on the left spectrum. So I don't know if there's any other philosophers who use the same and come up with a decidedly right-wing, you know, kind of like authoritarian sort of like picture of the world that they want.
Well, we haven't brought this up yet, but the thing that makes him philosophically the same as those people that you're talking about, Adorno comes to mind. But this, it's anti-Hegelian, really. That's what saying we need multipolar or a pluralist time is saying, is we want a non-Hegelian history. And in Fukuyaman fashion, the Hegelian history is one of eternal expansion of the neoliberal nation state, embodied in this case by NATO countries.
Yeah, I think what he does a lot better than Jordan Peterson is he elaborates this eclectic base of ideas and areas of thinking, and then he kind of relates them directly and extensively to politics, which Jordan Peterson is really dog shit at doing that.
Yeah, we were complaining a few weeks ago about how boring Jordan Peterson is and how shitty his interpretations are. So here's the interesting
Dugin's
one.
good at it. Dugin's just good at it. That's all.
I also think that I'll also like to be, I think Peterson is a modernist. He's for the Western project. I think he's a globalist. I mean,
self-described classical liberal.
He's a liberal. Like, I don't actually think, like, yes, he has a conservative spin, but I think he's very much within the mind frame of, like, the West is doing something important that needs to be spread to the rest of the world. Like, I think he is a bit of a proselytizer for a kind of individualist, kind of like neat, like Christian-esque sort of like
the
view
private
of
individual.
The world. The private individual. So ultimately, he is like part of the modern Western project, and I think so. So in that sense, he's quite divergent.
Yeah, I mean, I think David Harvey gives a good intimation of what happened. In that I mentioned this already, that comparison between the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation of Germany is setting the stage for World War II, and then I guess. After World War II, the lesson was learned, and the penalties were not harsh like they were after World War I. That generation of politicians seems to have died out and not passed their knowledge on. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia was humiliated, excluded, treated as a basket case. The ruble went into hyperinflation. They were trading in vodka at one point, which is where all the jokes come from. And again, now we have this situation again where this humiliated, trampled on nation is again coming back for revenge with an even more distorted kind of ideology than the one that first was taken down. And so we have this parallel again between, humiliation in the one hand and humiliation on the other hand. And humiliation is a dangerous political tool. It is very fucking dangerous. And again, the same thing has happened to China, right? They've been humiliated, colonized by Britain, colonized by Japan. They have a deep memory. All these humiliations are going to come back and fuck us over. And there's not much that we can do about it because the seeds were laid by a previous generation of idiot politicians who didn't give a shit about what the next generation was going to have to deal with. And now we're dealing with it. I think that's an interesting line of argument that Harvey brings up anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting.
All right. Well, we've been going for a while. Are there any quick final thoughts?
How are you guys feeling about the potential of nuclear catastrophe?
Another Chernobyl.
It's back.
Saying,
the Cold War is back. Yeah.
Another
Chernobyl.
I
don't know. I was just
large tracts of Europe going to be uninhabitable.
Are those NORAD bases still up? Like, or is Toronto within range of an ICBM coming over the North Pole?
So Canada is not part of the missile shield. The United States does have a missile shield, which they could potentially use. But none of that actually matters because Russia has these hypersonic ICBMs that the current technology of America's missile shield can do nothing about. So if they wanted to, they could bomb any target in America.
Yeah, the missiles will go into space at an incredible speed, and it'll all be over in 30 minutes.
They would actually get to the United States from Russia in less than 5 minutes. That's how fast these nukes are.
we've all forgot, but we do still live under MAD, right? Mutually assured destruction. That doesn't stop.
I'd have to, maybe I'm a little over exaggerating that, but my understanding is I think they're
no,
they're like 20 times the speed of sound. These hypersonic ICBMs.
Yeah. I mean, it won't. If one side launches the nukes, the other side launches the nukes. They're all targeted already, so they'll just be everything will be destroyed. That's not a way forward for anybody. The only real thing you could possibly worry about is if Putin sees he's losing, he might just be like, all right, well, I'm taking you all down with me. Ah. But other than that, I mean, it's not a way forward.
Until Toronto is nuked, stay tuned. Every Friday, we put something out. And why don't we wrap up on that happy note?
On that optimism, yeah.
And actually, I will tell you right now. So the fastest ICBM goes 24,000 kilometers per hour.
Yeah, I mean, at this
so that would take more than
an
hour to get here.
Well, are we 24,000 kilometers from Russia?
Probably.
I would put it at around that.
What's the circumference of the Earth? I can't.
All of our
remember.
maps, because of all of our map projections, distort it, so it's difficult to tell because they're.
It's 6,000 kilometers.
All of our maps are very Atlantocentric, so it would take 2 hours or 3.
No, it wouldn't. No, it would take way less. 6,000. It's 24,000 kilometers an hour. It'd be here in like 15 minutes.
Oh, 24,000. I was thinking 2,400. Yeah. Okay.
No, 24,000 kilometers. So it'll be here in like 15 minutes.
Oh, that's a lot. I was thinking 2,400. Damn, that's quick.
Barely enough time to put your coat and shoes on and get out the door.
Yeah.
No point in doing it. Yeah.
So what are you going to do when the missile launches, Victor? Be just... You should have been liberal. Yeah.
No. We should do an episode on Dr. Strangelove. That'd be a fun one.
Yeah. How to love it. How to stop worrying.
I definitely am not worried. I actually find it more fascinating than worrying, to be honest, which maybe means I'm sick, but I find it it's just so much more interesting than the stupid truckers or like vaccine protests. I'm like, finally something interesting is happening.
No war but the culture war.
Yeah, exactly. I'm tired of being annoyed by things that don't actually matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's a good note to end on, I think.
All right. Cheers, guys. Cheers. Listeners. Goodbye.
Later, y'all.